Shalom. This week we are reading Parashat Noach, the second Torah portion in the book of Bereshit, Genesis. You know, 10 generations elapsed between the time of Adam and the time of Noah. 10 generations after creation, despite, presumably, the personal relationship enjoyed between Adam and God, and the education that Adam must have passed on to his children, the message of God was somehow obscured and then lost altogether. By the time of Noah's generation, mankind had become so depraved that God decided it could not be saved. We are taught that one of the main tragedies, one of the main faults, one of the main characteristics of the generation of the flood was rampant, institutionalized, and state-licensed promiscuity, sexual deviance, and depravity. These sins are alluded to in the last verses of last week's Torah portion, Bereshit, where we read chapter 6 and verse 5, "And the Lord saw that the evil of man was great in the earth, and every imagination of his heart was only evil all the time. And the Lord regretted that he had made man upon the earth, and he became grieved in his heart. And the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I created, from upon the face of the earth, from man to cattle, to creeping thing, to the fowl of the heavens, for I regret that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord." So there's a very deep teaching here that has to do with sexual sins, the type of which that are being alluded to here were so brazen and so extreme that, owing to the family nature of these lessons, we won't go into the details here. Suffice it to say that present-day Western society is following closely behind, and suffice it to say that our sages teach that this particular category of human failure and negativity brings about the very undoing of man. And in very extreme situations, such as that which was manifest at the time of the generation of the flood, when this behavior becomes standardized and acceptable and condoned by society, the natural divine consequences are that destructive forces are unleashed against man, and when this happens, it is possible that no distinction will be made between the bad and good people will be swept up with the bad, because society as a whole is open and subject to retribution in direct proportion to its tolerance for evil. So in a way, this category of sin was very much responsible for bringing down the wrath on that generation. However, interestingly, the Torah itself indicates, and our sages explain, that this is not what sealed the verdict on that generation. As terrible as that behavior was, as detested and abhorrent as it was in the eyes of God, God did not consider this to be reason enough to bring the flood and destroy the earth. He was still willing to wait and give them another chance. Ultimately, it was something else. There was another category of degenerate behavior involving another type of sin between man and his fellow man, which is even more hated, believe it or not, by God, and even more morally reprehensible in his eyes than this wicked generation of the flood was also heavily involved in, invested in, as it were. This sinful behavior, this is what tipped the scales and sealed the verdict and forced God's hand, so to speak. For if it were not for this, all else could somehow have been tolerated. And what was this final straw? The behavior for which God brought about the flood? The Torah itself openly declares and bears witness. And we read, "Now the earth was corrupt before God, and the earth became full of robbery. And God saw the earth, and behold, it had become corrupted, for all flesh had corrupted its way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth has become full of robbery because of them, and behold, I am destroying them from the earth." It was this very extreme, twisted, mega type of robbery described in these 3 verses in our Torah portion of Noah that sealed the fate of this generation. In a word, according to this powerful midrashic depiction, this robbery could perhaps most effectively be described as organized crime. Here is a scene described by the Midrash. At the market, a seller would be displaying his wares, a huge barrel, vessel full of beans, little beans. The townspeople would all line up and pass by the vendor in single file, and each person would reach into the barrel and take just one bean. In this manner, all the people collectively would despoil the merchant of all his wares, stealing everything he had and taking his livelihood from him, each one having taken just one bean. And this being market day, the court was also in session outdoors, and the justices would be sitting on their bench to try cases brought to them to mete out fair justice to the populace. And all this was done, this organized robbery was done not only by the light of day, but in the plain sight, in front of the eyes of the judges, and the judges were helpless to stop it, powerless, because since according to their laws, a person is not liable for stealing an item whose value is, let's say, less than a penny, insignificant amount, one person was not found liable of guilty, but a crime was committed, a man's livelihood was stolen from him, and no one could be prosecuted. Teamwork. Needless to say, or maybe not so needless, this stark example of institutionalized robbery is only a small example of how decadent the society was, and actually it's a metaphor whose purpose is to inform us of a civilization that lost all regard for its own humanity and grew utterly callous, insensitive, and self-serving. So it doesn't matter if this particular example really happened or if it's just a poetic vehicle. The point is, they were very, very bad. They raped and stole each other's wives as they raped the earth, and the attributes of the generation spread somehow to the earth itself. In other words, the earth itself became so corrupted, infected, so spoiled, that from this force of violence, that the earth itself was in need of a restart. And thus, verse 11 tells us, verse 11 and 12 reads, "Now the earth had become corrupt before God, and the earth had become filled with robbery. And God saw that the earth, and behold, it was corrupted." Our sages describe that the root of this stealing, what it was really all about, was about stealing the shefa, meaning stealing by force the actual divine blessing that was allocated for the world. In other words, the true intention of these people was to steal from God himself. But the Hebrew word employed here by the verses that we cited above, as we translated here in the particular English version that we cited, translated as robbery, it's a singular word, and it's not the usual word used by the Torah for robbery. And this word would be more properly translated and more accurately, as it is sometimes, as violent robbery. Because that is its true meaning. It means robbery by force accompanied by violence and with the inflicting of pain and suffering, robbery by strong arm. Now, the Hebrew word for this violent robbery is Hamas. And I'm like, this is really interesting, because everybody knows that Hamas, pronounced the same way, is in Arabic the acronym for Harakat al-Mukawama al-Islamiyah, or the Islamic Resistance Movement, a terrorist organization dedicated to the destruction of Israel, whose tactics include suicide bombings, rocket attacks, condemned as war crimes against humanity by human rights groups such as Human Rights Watch, and directly responsible for the murder of many of the over 1,550 Israelis that have been murdered since the Oslo Accords were signed, not including the Israelis murdered today. And this is really interesting. The Arabic word Hamas means enthusiasm or zeal. And the Hamas covenant interprets its name to mean strength and bravery. And there is no coincidence. There is no better definition of evil denoted by this word, there is no better understanding of violent robbery than the horrors being perpetrated against the Jewish people by those whose definition of zeal, enthusiasm, strength, and bravery is the butchery of random Jews, babies, women, the elderly, everyone. And it sure fits the understanding of our sages, all right, of violent robbery. For their intention is to rob the land of Israel from the people of Israel by violence. Indeed, to steal the divine blessing that was allocated for this world from God Himself by force. As of this recording today, early afternoon, Tuesday, October 13th, 3 Jews have been murdered here in Jerusalem, and many more have been wounded in multiple terror attacks in Jerusalem and throughout Israel, including shooting, stabbing, running over civilians at bus stops. And Radio Hamas officially calls it a day of revenge and gloats that it has successfully brought Israel to a stop. Maybe you haven't heard any of this. Now, after the generation of the flood, we read in our Torah portion of another very problematic generation. It's called the generation of the dispersion because they had to be dispersed, separated by God. We read in the beginning of chapter 11, now the entire earth was of one language and uniform words, and it came to pass when they traveled from the east that they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." So the bricks were to them for stones, and the clay was to them for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make ourselves a name, lest we be scattered upon the face of the entire earth." Now, these folks, they did not learn their lesson from their predecessors, the generation of the flood. Now, ostensibly, they were a better lot than the former, because they were united. We read in these verses that they were united in one common purpose, and everybody knows, they worked together, not against each other, like in the generation of the flood. They had a common purpose. Everybody knows that God loves unity. But the truth is, there were important differences between the generation of the flood and the generation of the dispersion. The motivation, the backdrop of the moral decay of the generation of the flood was a lack of gratitude. Such is what we are taught, that they felt that they had everything. And the Midrash describes how they said, what a beautiful world this is. It's full of beautiful fresh water, rivers and streams. And they felt that they did not need anything from God. They don't need Him for anything. And that, our sages teach us, why God punished them with water. But the motivation behind the actions of the generation of the dispersion were different. They were united in their rebellion against God. Their intention was to rise up to heaven, as it were, and replace God altogether. They went a step ahead of their predecessors in declaring, "We don't need your favors, and we don't need you." And in this, they were united. And the chilling midrashic description of their society is reminiscent of today's world as well. We are told that they had a hugely developed, technically advanced system for building the tower, which reached apparently at least 70 miles high before it came down. They had a mechanism for hoisting the bricks all the way to the top. And when a brick accidentally fell from the top and thus put them slightly behind in their work, they all stopped and wept and mourned. But when a person fell in the middle of working, they just kept right on working. So this was not real unity. It was evil united against God. Please note that not only is Hamas responsible for the murder of Jews for being Jews in Israel, but the Palestinian Authority daily incites and inspires its denizens to murder, calling the terrorists heroes, praising the shedding of Jewish blood, and the sold-out, empowering, enabling, promiscuous West is right there in the building of that arabesque tower, busily and willfully, blindly hoisting the elaborate petard of its own self-destruction. Because, you know, there is an amazing idea that our sages teach, that at the time of the Great Flood, the floodwaters did not enter into the land of Israel. The land of Israel was dry, was not affected by the flood. And so too, they teach that in the future, when it all falls apart, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, will be the Noah's Ark of the entire world, dry and safe. So don't worry about us. But if you fear God, you should worry about yourselves, as the world becomes engulfed by the evil of man that once again is great upon the earth.